December 1944. A thin winter sun hangs over a makeshift American POW processing camp somewhere on the outskirts of Metz. The ground is frozen hard, scattered with abandoned helmets, torn greatcoats, and the debris of a retreat that had ended only hours before. German prisoners stand in silence, their breath rising in pale clouds. Their faces a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. Many are young, still gripping the last remnants of their soldier's identity. An American sergeant steps forward, carrying a battered canvas satchel recovered from a destroyed German field post truck. The flap hangs open, revealing stacks of folded envelopes stained with mud, others carefully tied with frayed string. Letters home. Messages that never reached wives, children, or parents waiting far behind the collapsing front. The prisoners watch as the sergeant begins reading out names, his voice steady, almost gentle. One by one, men step forward, stunned, unsure whether this is real. A few hesitate, expecting humiliation. Others reach out with trembling hands, unable to believe that, in the middle of a brutal winter war, an American soldier would return what they feared lost forever. And in this quiet exchange, a deeper story begins, one rooted in the world that shaped this unlikely moment. By the final months of 1944, the Second World War had entered a phase defined by exhaustion, collapse, and the relentless pressure of advancing Allied armies. Following the breakout from Normandy in August, American forces surged across France with a speed that stunned both enemy commanders and their own logistical planners. German formations, already bleeding from months of attrition, fell back in disorganized clusters. Many had lost contact with their units. Others were surrounded before they realized the front had shifted behind them. In this environment, the number of German prisoners of war taken by the U.S. Army rose sharply. From Normandy through the Lorraine campaign, thousands were captured each week. Field processing stations often improvised in barns, orchards, schoolyards, and even roadside clearings became critical nodes in managing this human tide. Soldiers arriving at these stations brought whatever they had carried through the battle: weapons, maps, diaries, photographs, and always, letters. Letters written to wives they had not seen in years. Two mothers who feared each knock on the door. Two children who barely remembered their faces. For German soldiers, much like their American counterparts, these personal messages were emotional anchors in a war that had stripped away normal life. American officers knew the significance of such documents, yet regulations required that all papers be confiscated upon capture. The reasoning was partly administrative and partly rooted in intelligence needs. Even the smallest scrap of handwriting could reveal unit movements, fuel shortages, morale problems, or mentions of new enemy weapons. Every battlefield letter was screened not just for secrets but for tone. Analysts looked for despair, confidence, or ideological conviction. In late 1944, such documents frequently revealed the same things: fear of encirclement, disbelief at the scale of Allied firepower, and a growing sense that Germany's defeat was inevitable. At the same time, American frontline troops had become deeply familiar with the personal side of war. Many carried their own bundles of mail photographs tucked inside helmets, folded letters wrapped in waterproof pouches, and envelopes bearing the careful handwriting of someone waiting back home. It was impossible not to recognize the emotional weight contained in the captured German correspondence. A soldier reading an unfamiliar language could still understand the universal shape of longing in a letter folded many times, or the careful effort in a drawing made by a child. As the fighting pushed into eastern France, the U.S. Army adhered strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment of enemy prisoners. American forces provided food, medical care, and shelter at levels that often exceeded what German troops had recently experienced in their own depleted and retreating units. Red Cross inspectors regularly reported that conditions, while basic, were in accordance with international standards. These same inspectors also noted the attention given to POW property watches, photographs, religious items, and personal letters. In many cases, the U.S. military allowed prisoners to retain sentimental objects unless they posed a security risk. But letters were different. They were considered potential intelligence material. Field units collected them routinely after battles, often gathering them from abandoned mailbags, pockets, or dugouts hastily evacuated during retreats. These collections, stored temporarily in satchels or ammunition boxes, moved through the system like any other captured document. What varied was how individual American officers chose to handle them once they were reviewed and found harmless. Some archived them for record keeping. Others destroyed them to avoid clutter. A few, however, made the decision quietly, sometimes without fanfare, to return them to the men who had written them. This practice was not formal policy, but it emerged organically from a combination of humanitarian instinct and battlefield pragmatism. A prisoner who received a letter from home often became calmer, more cooperative, and less prone to the tension that sometimes gripped processing camps following heavy fighting. American guards noticed this repeatedly. A man who held a piece of home in his hands was less likely to act out of fear or despair. This convergence of war's brutality and fleeting acts of humanity set the stage for the moment when those German POWs, standing in the bitter cold of a French winter, heard their names called and watched their lost letters being handed back to them. Letters they believed were gone forever. And to understand how this singular act fit into the broader machinery of the war, the deeper mechanics of POW processing must be explored. When a German soldier was captured in 1944, the process that followed was precise, procedural, and shaped by lessons learned from earlier campaigns. American military police or infantry units responsible for initial handling began by disarming the prisoner, ensuring medical needs were addressed, and establishing basic identity through verbal questioning. From there, the man was escorted to a nearby temporary collection point, where his personal effects were laid out on a table or blanket for inspection. Watches, rings, wallets, and correspondence were examined but usually returned, provided they held no intelligence value. Weapons, insignia, and unique documents were taken immediately for analysis. The system was efficient, designed to keep both guards and prisoners stable in an environment of constant movement. Captured papers, including letters, were handled differently. Each item passed through a chain of soldiers trained to evaluate foreign documents. The U.S. Army's Field Intelligence Teams, known as IPW Interrogation of Prisoners of War Units, reviewed this material for any mention of enemy positions, supply issues, morale, or references to commanders. Much of what they found in personal letters was mundane: updates on weather at home, mentions of harvest, or quiet expressions of longing. Yet even these mundane elements provided valuable insight into the psychological state of German forces. Still, once the intelligence value was exhausted, the U.S. Army faced a choice. Regulations did not require the destruction of personal letters, nor did they forbid their return. The outcome often depended on the judgment of officers at each processing point. Some adhered to a strict interpretation of confiscation, storing letters in file boxes that would eventually be archived or discarded. Others believed that returning these emotional lifelines could reduce stress within POW compounds, where overcrowding, exhaustion, and uncertainty sometimes led to tension. By late 1944, the scale of German capitulation had forced the U.S. military to refine and streamline its POW operations. Camps across France, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself absorbed tens of thousands of prisoners. In many of these facilities, American soldiers were surprised by the unexpected discipline of their captives. German troops, having been conditioned for years by military hierarchy, responded predictably to clear orders and structured routines. Guards quickly discovered that small gestures honoring property rights, allowing keepsakes, or returning inspected letters had an outsized effect on maintaining order. The psychological component was significant. Military psychiatrists attached to certain U.S. units noted that POWs who held reminders of home exhibited fewer signs of panic or despondency. Letters reduced the sense of dislocation that came with sudden capture. They anchored a prisoner to a world beyond the barbed wire, easing fears about what might happen to their families and, just as importantly, what might happen to them under American custody. This humane approach stood in stark contrast to what many Germans had believed before their capture. Years of propaganda had painted the Western Allies as ruthless, indifferent, or vindictive. Some expected immediate brutality. Others feared they would be shipped to distant labor camps under harsh conditions, finding themselves instead treated according to international law, and occasionally handed back letters they assumed were lost in the chaos. Produced a deep cultural dissonance. Red Cross representatives who toured POW facilities documented this reaction repeatedly. Many prisoners expressed shock at the relative fairness of their treatment, and letters returned by American guards became part of these reports. Among U.S. soldiers, opinions varied. Some viewed the return of enemy letters as an unnecessary courtesy in a war defined by bitter combat. Others, particularly those who understood the importance of mail from their own experience, saw it as a small but meaningful act that cost nothing and gained much. Officers noticed that prisoners who received such gestures often became more willing to provide accurate personal information, follow instructions without resistance, and maintain discipline inside the camp. All of these elements: military procedure, psychological insight, humanitarian instinct, and the quiet influence of international observers formed the environment in which that satchel of German letters was finally opened in a snow-covered clearing near Metz. The scene would not have unfolded as it did without the evolving systems and attitudes behind it. And to fully understand this moment, one must explore the intersecting angles that shaped the behavior of both American soldiers and the German POWs who stood before them throughout the Second World War. Letters were not merely pieces of paper. They were emotional oxygen for German soldiers fighting on multiple collapsing fronts. Correspondence from home was the most reliable proof that life still existed beyond the rubble. And retreat, a single envelope, creased from being read dozens of times, could soften the hardest days and strengthen the will to endure. Men tucked letters into breast pockets, helmet liners, and bread bags. They guarded them with a care that surpassed even their rations. Because in the bleak arithmetic of war, food sustained the body, but letters sustained the soul. Many German soldiers captured in France had not received mail for weeks. Retreat, disorganized logistics, and increasing Allied pressure fractured the postal system. Field post units struggled to keep up. A man might march for days unaware that his wife had just given birth, or that his father had fallen ill, or that the barn he grew up in had been destroyed in an air raid. Every unopened letter carried the weight of unknown news, hope, or heartbreak sealed behind a thin paper barrier. Thus, when American soldiers returned those letters after processing them for intelligence, the prisoners experienced a moment that reached deeper than military courtesy. They were being offered a connection to the world they feared lost. The war had stripped them of weapons, status, and freedom. But this fragment of normal life restored something far more meaningful. Even soldiers hardened by months of fighting felt their defenses weaken. For a brief moment, the lines between enemy and captor blurred, replaced by the universal human need to belong to someone waiting at home. To understand why American soldiers sometimes chose to return confiscated German letters, one must consider the cultural and institutional framework that shaped their actions. The U.S. Army of 1944 fought with discipline, but also with a distinct moral code reinforced by training, upbringing, and national values. Many of the guards and frontline soldiers were ordinary men, farmers, teachers, factory workers who understood the emotional power of a letter, because they themselves depended on it to stay connected to home. They knew the relief of seeing a familiar handwriting after weeks of silence. They knew how a single envelope could steady the nerves before combat or comfort a man who had lost a friend. This personal experience shaped how they viewed the prisoners under their supervision. While they obeyed strict rules regarding what could and could not be kept, they did not approach these decisions with malice. The return of harmless letters was, for some, an act of quiet professionalism, recognizing that humane treatment could maintain order in the camp. For others, it was a reflection of their own values. They understood that even an enemy soldier could be a husband, a son, a father. Moreover, American procedure encouraged fairness. Training manuals emphasized that POWs were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention, and officers reiterated that compliance reflected not weakness but discipline. In this environment, returning letters after inspection did not feel like an exception. It felt like consistency with the Army's broader standards of conduct. In the eyes of many U.S. soldiers, handing a man his long-awaited letter was not an act of sympathy. It was an affirmation of their own identity. A soldier could maintain humanity without compromising strength, and in a war full of harsh decisions, this small gesture served as a reminder that not every choice required hardness. Yet the return of letters did not occur in a vacuum. There was a practical, methodical reason these items were collected in the first place. The U.S. Army's intelligence apparatus considered personal correspondence an important window into the state of the German war machine. A simple phrase, "Food is scarce, no replacements arrived, the fuel shipments are delayed," could provide analysts with real insights into the condition of enemy forces. Even references to weather patterns, clothing shortages, or changes in morale contributed to the broader picture being assembled at division and Army headquarters. Field intelligence teams became adept at quickly evaluating stacks of captured letters. They sorted them by date, location, and subject matter, identifying anything that might reveal troop dispositions or strategic anxieties. By late 1944, such letters increasingly conveyed a tone of fatigue and resignation. Men wrote about dwindling supplies, hopeless attacks, and rumors of overwhelming Allied strength. These emotional clues, while not tactical information, helped American commanders gauge morale across German units. But after the intelligence was extracted, the documents lost their strategic value. Most contained no addresses that led to espionage networks, no coded instructions, no hidden messages. They were simply what they appeared to be, fragments of personal lives. And once the analysis was complete, returning them posed no risk. Their power was emotional, not military. Thus, intelligence procedure and humanitarian impulse converged. Once the Army had taken what it needed in terms of information, the letters reverted to what they were before, deeply personal belongings of defeated soldiers. For many German POWs, the moment they received their letters back was not just emotional, it was disorienting. Years of Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as morally corrupt, culturally inferior, and ruthlessly violent. Soldiers were told that surrendering to the Allies meant humiliation at best and cruelty at worst. These narratives intensified as the front collapsed. Men were warned that American soldiers would mock them, starve them, or subject them to harsh treatment. Instead, they encountered discipline, procedure, and, in moments like the return of letters, unexpected decency. This contrast produced a psychological jolt. Prisoners who braced for hostility found themselves treated with respect. Guards issued instructions without shouting. Medical personnel tended to wounds without discrimination. The simple act of handing back a letter contradicted the entire image they had been taught to believe. It humanized the enemy and forced them to reconsider the nature of the conflict. Some POWs later wrote in memoirs that this moment marked the first time they understood the war from outside the ideological framework they had grown up in. A letter returned in a foreign soldier's hand became, for many, the first hint of a world beyond propaganda. And from these converging angles, human, tactical, cultural, and procedural, the stage was set for the deeper layers of the story still unfolding. The United States entered the Second World War with a clear understanding that its international reputation would be shaped not only by battlefield success but also by its adherence to the laws governing armed conflict. The 1929 Geneva Convention, which outlined the treatment of prisoners of war, was not merely a diplomatic formality, it was a reflection of national values and a strategic asset. Compliance demonstrated discipline, moral authority, and a commitment to principles that the Axis powers frequently violated. Returning confiscated letters, though never explicitly mandated, fit comfortably within this framework. A prisoner who received his personal correspondence back experienced something beyond relief. He experienced legitimacy. The gesture communicated that he was not being held by a vengeful adversary seeking retribution, but by a military force operating under rules stronger than anger. American officers understood that such actions strengthened the United States' moral position in the eyes of neutral observers, particularly the International Committee of the Red Cross. Reports from these inspectors influenced global opinion, shaping narratives far beyond the front lines. Every humane decision, no matter how small, became part of a larger tapestry that contrasted sharply with German atrocities documented on other fronts. Thus, when an American sergeant returned a stack of weathered letters to a group of German POWs, the act resonated on multiple levels. It fulfilled moral principles, supported discipline within the camp, and reinforced the United States' commitment to conducting itself as a lawful force and identity that mattered deeply during a war fought not only with weapons, but with ideals. Behind the scenes of every POW camp in Western Europe operated a network of Red Cross delegates who monitored compliance, facilitated communication, and documented conditions. Their mission was not political, it was humanitarian. They carried forms, parcel lists, notebooks, and an unwavering dedication to ensuring that both sides honored their obligations. Mail played a central role in this oversight. The Red Cross facilitated much of the official correspondence between prisoners and their families, while letters written after capture followed a regulated path through censor offices and neutral agencies. Pre-capture letters, those confiscated on the battlefield, fell into a gray area. They were technically personal property, but they had also passed through intelligence screening. When an American camp chose to return such letters, Red Cross officers observed the effect immediately. Prisoners who had been pale, withdrawn, or anxious often brightened when they held familiar handwriting again. These moments became points of emphasis in Red Cross reports, which quietly praised U.S. facilities for acknowledging the emotional needs of their captives. This system also created a sense of trust. POWs who saw that letters were handled with care, reviewed, documented, and eventually returned grew more confident in the fairness of their captors. Such trust reduced friction within the camp and helped establish a stable environment, one in which violence or escape attempts were far less likely. It was a form of quiet diplomacy conducted entirely through envelopes and ink. Thus, even though the Red Cross did not directly orchestrate the return of battlefield letters, its presence encouraged practices that upheld dignity. In the structured silence of a POW compound, the soft rustle of open envelopes often carried more influence than shouted orders. War is not fought solely through force. It is shaped by morale, perception, and psychological pressure. American commanders understood that treating prisoners humanely could have strategic consequences. A soldier who believed he would be well treated was more likely to surrender than to fight to the last man. Conversely, reports of cruelty could harden resistance and prolong battles unnecessarily. Returning letters fit neatly into this psychological landscape. It whispered a message into the heart of every captured man. Surrender does not mean disappearance. Surrender does not mean being cut off from the world. Surrender does not mean destruction of one's identity. Such realizations traveled beyond the barbed wire. POWs who wrote new letters home described their treatment often contrasting it sharply with what German propaganda had warned. These letters filtered back into civilian communities, and occasionally even into the ranks of the Wehrmacht itself. Word of mouth passed quietly from soldier to soldier, expanded the influence of simple acts of decency. This was not manipulation in the sinister sense. It was the strategic use of humanity. American officers recognized that a calm, cooperative POW population made camps easier to manage and freed resources for frontline operations. Humane treatment was both morally grounded and operationally efficient. A return letter, then, was more than a sentimental gesture. It was a tool that diminished fear, diffused hostility, and subtly weakened the ideological armor that many German soldiers had carried into battle. With these angles established, human, procedural, psychological, cultural, and moral, the stage is set for the defining moment when these forces intersected on a cold winter day in 1944. The letters that would soon astonish a group of German prisoners began their journey in the aftermath of a short, violent engagement outside the French town of Gravelotte. The firefight had lasted less than an hour, an exchange of rifle fire, machine gun burst, and a final artillery staccato that ended with white flags emerging from a tree line, soaked in smoke. When the shooting stopped, American infantrymen moved cautiously among the captured positions, searching for surviving enemy soldiers and securing the area before darkness fell. Among the scattered belongings left behind by the retreating German unit was a roadside field post truck, its rear doors blown open by shrapnel. Inside lay a chaos of canvas bags, clipped bundles, and loose envelopes that had been sorted for delivery before the sudden attack broke the line. Some letters were weeks old, others were freshly written, their ink still dark and unblemished by rain. They carried the full spectrum of wartime emotion: farewells, reassurances, confessions, and quiet notes of love that had been intended to slip across Europe toward towns and villages now deep in uncertainty. American soldiers piled the scattered correspondence into a canvas satchel and brought it back to their command post. Regulations dictated that all captured documents, no matter how trivial, be sent for intelligence review. So the letters passed through several hands: clerks, interpreters, and intelligence officers who skimmed their contents with professional detachment. A few mentioned supply shortages. Others spoke of the cold, of illness, of fear. But none contained military secrets or coded messages. When the assessment was complete, the letters were cleared of tactical significance and set aside. Technically no longer needed. It was an American captain, a man known among his men for his calm temperament, who made the decision that would shape what happened next. Seeing the satchel pushed to the corner of a desk, he asked about its contents. When told they were personal letters written by the very men now sitting behind concertina wire at the temporary POW enclosure, he paused, not for authority, but for clarity. They posed no risk. They had already been reviewed, and the approaching winter had already taken its emotional toll on both sides of the line. Give them back, he instructed quietly. They belonged to the men who wrote them. The order was simple, but its implications were not. Few American soldiers had ever seen enemy correspondence returned. Some wondered whether it was wise. Others felt it was unnecessary. Yet the sergeant chosen to carry out the task understood its weight instantly. He, too, kept letters from home folded inside his jacket. He had read one so many times that the ink had begun to fade. If he lost it in combat, and somehow a stranger returned it to him, he knew exactly how that moment would feel. That evening, as the winter sky turned a deep iron blue, the sergeant walked toward the enclosure where the newly captured Germans awaited transfer. A hush fell over the men as they saw him approach with the canvas satchel. The cold had settled into their bones. Many had not warmed up since their surrender. They watched him stop at the fence line and open the flap of the bag, revealing neat stacks of letters, some marked with censor stamps, others tied with twine. Still others bending slightly at the edges from being carried in pockets during long marches. He spoke clearly, reading name after name. The first man who stepped forward hesitated, as though expecting ridicule or reprimand. But the sergeant held out the envelope with a steady hand, offering it without ceremony. Another man came forward, and another. Soon a line formed, slow but continuous, each prisoner taking his letter with disbelief written plainly across his face. Some held their envelopes tightly without opening them, as though the mere weight of them was enough. Others broke the seals immediately, their eyes scanning words they had long feared were lost. A few stood frozen, overcome not by the content but by the gesture itself. These were men who had been told that American soldiers were merciless. Yet here, in the dim light of a winter evening, the enemy was returning pieces of their identity, quiet messages from home that reminded them they were more than prisoners, more than soldiers caught in a collapsing war. American guards watched in silence. They saw hardened men swallow emotion, straighten their posture, or turn away to read in private. The atmosphere within the enclosure changed subtly but unmistakably. Fear gave way to something steadier, something that allowed the camp to breathe. But the full impact of this moment, its psychological shift, its unexpected consequences would only become clear in the hours and days that followed. What unfolded after the letters were handed out did not erupt in noise or celebration. It unfolded instead in small movements, subtle gestures, and quiet transformations that spread through the camp like a change in air pressure. The German POWs, still shivering in the December cold, retreated to their assigned corners of the enclosure. Some sat alone on crates or rolled blankets, reading under the fading light. Others gathered in pairs, sharing fragments of their letters in low voices. A few who had received bad news lowered their heads, but even they seemed steadier, as though finally knowing the truth was better than the weight of endless uncertainty. American soldiers observed this shift with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Guards who had expected resentment or suspicion instead found the prisoners unusually calm. The usual tension present whenever exhausted. Newly captured soldiers sat in close confinement had softened. Men who only hours earlier had raised their hands in surrender now spoke with a kind of grounded clarity. They asked fewer anxious questions. They followed orders without hesitation. A sense of order settled over the enclosure that no amount of shouted instruction could have produced. That night, after rations were distributed, a Red Cross representative conducting routine inspections paused at the sight of POWs, quietly reading by lantern light. He took notes, unaware that he would later document this moment as a striking example of emotional stabilization within a recently formed camp. In his report, he wrote that the prisoners showed notable composure and cooperative spirit following the return of personal correspondence, though understated. These remarks would be read by U.S. Army officers overseeing POW operations across the region, reinforcing the understanding that humane actions could generate practical, measurable benefits. Inside the enclosure, the ripple effects continued. One group of prisoners, many from the same infantry regiment, huddled together as a man read aloud a letter describing the winter hardships. Their families faced back home the rationing, the blackouts, the shortages. Another letter described a newborn daughter, written in careful script by a wife who had not yet received word of her husband's capture. The men listening fell into a heavy silence, each imagining the faces of those waiting for them across the collapsing Reich. What surprised the American guards most was what happened the following morning, when intelligence officers returned to conduct standardized interviews, routine questions about unit structure, logistics, and identification. The prisoners responded with a calm rarely seen in newly captured men. There was no defiance, no evasiveness born of panic. Several POWs offered clear answers to basic administrative questions, making the process efficient and orderly. One officer later remarked in his notes that the men carried themselves as though a burden had been removed. The letters had not transformed their allegiance, but they had softened the edge of fear. The psychological shift extended beyond cooperation. Some prisoners approached guards with simple requests: extra water, clarification on procedures, medical attention for a wounded comrade. These interactions, normally tense or hesitant, occurred with a quiet dignity. The Americans, in turn, treated the request with straightforward professionalism. Both sides seemed aware that something delicate and unspoken had taken place, a moment of humanity that neither doctrine nor propaganda had prepared them for. Among the German soldiers, discussions about the previous evening spread quickly. Men who had not received letters still felt the weight of the moment. They spoke of the fairness of their captors, the unexpected respect shown to them, and the contrast between their expectations and reality. A few admitted privately that they were relieved the Americans, not another force, had captured them. These were dangerous thoughts in the ideology they had lived under for years, but captivity had begun to reshape their understanding of the world. Meanwhile, the sergeant who had returned the letters walked the perimeter that morning with a quiet sense of completion. He had not acted for praise or recognition. In fact, he suspected the moment would be forgotten amid the war's larger narrative. Yet the way the prisoners looked at him, as though he had given back something irreplaceable, left an impression he would carry long after the guns fell silent. By midday, the camp settled into its routine. Prisoners lined up for roll call. Guards rotated shifts. Supply trucks rumbled through, stirring dust and frost. Nothing outwardly extraordinary occurred. And yet, beneath the surface, the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be forced through discipline alone. It was not victory. It was not surrender. It was something quieter, a thread of shared humanity pulled loose in a place defined by war. And as the POWs were prepared for transport to a more permanent camp, the long-term consequences of that single gesture began to reveal themselves. In the days following the return of the letters, the temporary POW enclosure near Metz transitioned into a steady rhythm. Trucks arrived to move prisoners to larger, more permanent camps deeper behind American lines, facilities designed to house thousands of men. Through the winter, As each group departed, American officers compiled reports documenting the condition, behavior, and morale of the prisoners. These reports, routine on the surface, revealed something notable when compared to previous captures, where earlier enclosures had struggled with anxiety-driven disruptions, escape attempts, or refusal to follow instructions. The Metz group showed none of these patterns. The guards described the prisoners as stable, cooperative, and consistently orderly. The Red Cross inspector, who had witnessed the reading of letters, submitted a formal note emphasizing that the men displayed an unusual calm for troops recently removed from combat. These observations rippled upward through administrative channels, shaping a quiet understanding that certain humane actions, simple though they were, could influence camp conditions far more effectively than rigid enforcement alone. At the same time, intelligence officers tracked another subtle change. German POWs processed after the letter return incident often provided more accurate basic data about their units. They did not divulge secrets or betray operational details. Few frontline soldiers ever possessed such information, but they were forthright about personal identity, unit affiliation, and logistical observations. This transparency significantly eased the administrative burden of processing thousands of captives, whose paperwork and identification were often incomplete or lost during retreat. More interestingly, captured correspondence began to take on secondary significance. When returning letters proved beneficial in Metz, some American units adopted similar practices when circumstances allowed. The policy was never formalized, never written into regulation, but officers and guards who heard of the incident recognized that the emotional state of POWs could dramatically impact camp operations. A letter returned at the right moment was not sentimentality, it was a stabilizing influence. Meanwhile, the German soldiers themselves carried the weight of this act into their new camps. Many wrote home describing the moment in detail. Some recounted the silence that fell as names were called. Others described the disbelief that Americans, whom they had expected to treat them with hostility, had shown respect for their personal lives. These letters, in turn, reached German households already strained by bombing, shortages, and the worsening war. Families learned that their sons were alive, captured, and critically being treated according to the laws of war. In homes where propaganda had long painted the Allies as merciless, this news brought unexpected relief. Such stories slowly circulated beyond private correspondence. After the war, Allied interrogators and historians studying German morale noted recurring references to moments of humane treatment, moments that undermine the extremes of Nazi ideology. While the return letters were a small detail in a vast conflict, they formed part of a broader pattern, evidence that the enemy their government had demonized did not always fit the image created for them. American camp administrators also recognized the long-term value of these practices. A calm, orderly POW population reduced the need for disciplinary measures, minimized guard casualties, and allowed resources to be redirected toward the front. It also improved cooperation during labor assignments, which many German POWs were later required to perform under Geneva Convention guidelines. In a logistical system strained by the demands of total war, such stability mattered. Yet the most profound consequence of the Metz incident was not logistical or strategic. It was psychological. For the German POWs who experienced it, the war's narrative had shifted. They were no longer faceless enemies in the eyes of their captors. They were men whose words, written in fear or longing, had been acknowledged and treated with dignity. This shift laid the foundation for deeper changes that would unfold in the months ahead, as captivity stretched into a long winter and the war's end drew closer. As the winter of 1944-45 pressed on, the German POWs who had experienced the return of their letters carried that memory into the larger, more structured camps scattered across France, Belgium, and eventually the United States. For many, what happened near Metz became a quiet touchstone, something they recounted to fellow prisoners as they settled into the routines of captivity roll calls, work details, censored correspondence, and the long, contemplative hours that filled days far removed from the front. In these larger camps, American officers quickly noticed the prisoners from the Metz transport blending smoothly into the environment. They were disciplined, calm, and more willing to adapt to camp regulations. Guards assigned to daily operations saw these men encourage others to respect procedures, avoid conflict, and maintain a sense of order that benefited everyone. The psychological steadiness that had taken root in Metz did not fade. It multiplied. Letters played a central role in this transition. Once officially registered as POWs, the men were permitted to write home through Red Cross channels. Many of them mentioned the moment they had been handed back their original correspondence. Wives, mothers, and siblings in Germany received these accounts with astonishment. Even amid tightening censorship and widespread hardship, families were relieved not just to learn their sons were alive, but that they were being treated humanely by the very enemy their government had demonized. These stories contributed to a subtle but meaningful shift in German civilian perception. While the Nazi regime still controlled public narrative, private letters carried a truth propaganda could not fully suppress. The enemy was not always as monstrous as claimed. This did not alter the course of the war, but it shaped the emotional landscape of thousands of households, trying to understand a world collapsing around them. For some POWs, especially younger ones who had never traveled beyond their hometowns before the war, captivity became their first sustained exposure to American culture. They observed how guards interacted with one another casual, straightforward, often with humor even in difficult conditions. They noticed differences in food and work expectations and the ways officers spoke to enlisted men. These details, minor at first glance, challenged long-held assumptions formed under rigid military indoctrination. After the war ended, many former POWs recalled that the first crack in those assumptions appeared when the Americans returned their letters. That gesture, simple, quiet, unpublicized, made them reconsider everything they had been told about the outside world. It planted a seed that later grew into openness toward new ideas and new identities. Some men carried that change back to Germany, where they helped rebuild communities and adopted more democratic values. Others never returned at all. Thousands of German POWs eventually emigrated to the United States after the war, drawn in part by experiences of fairness and dignity during captivity. Historians studying the long-term impact of POW treatment have noted that small acts can exert influence far beyond their immediate moment. The return letters from Metz did not alter military strategy or end the war, but they contributed to a broader pattern of humane interactions that softened post-war tensions. They reassured families, stabilized camps, and helped form early bridges between former enemies. American officers, reflecting on the incident in post-war interviews, often described it as an example of how discipline and compassion were not mutually exclusive. They emphasized that maintaining humanity under wartime pressure strengthened the moral fabric of the Allied forces. In their view, a soldier who could return an enemy's letter remained anchored to the values for which he fought. For the former POWs, the memory endured far longer. Many kept the return letters for the rest of their lives. The envelopes, worn and fragile decades later, symbolized a turning point and unexpected moment, when we're paused long enough for humanity to assert itself. And in that stillness, something remarkable took root: the realization that even in a world defined by destruction, small gestures could shape the path toward reconciliation. In the vast scale of the Second World War, conflict measured in ruined cities, shattered armies, and millions of lives uprooted, moments of humanity often seemed too small to matter. Yet history is shaped not only by grand strategies and decisive battles, but also by the quiet choices made in the spaces between them. The return of those German letters near Metz was one such choice. It did not change the direction of the war, but it changed something within the men who lived through it. For the prisoners, it was a reminder that even in defeat, dignity could survive. The envelopes they held were more than paper. They were fragments of a world they feared lost forever. Fragments restored by the very soldiers they had been taught to hate. For the Americans, the act affirmed a deeper truth: that strength in war is not measured only by firepower or victory, but by the ability to remain anchored to principle when conditions tempt otherwise. Such gestures reveal the strange paradox of war, that humanity can persist, even in the environments most hostile to it. A soldier handing a letter to his enemy is not weakening his cause. He is clarifying what it stands for. The moment passes quickly, unnoticed by most, but its effects ripple far beyond the boundaries of the battlefield. Years later, long after uniforms were folded away and borders redrawn, many former POWs would speak of this memory with quiet clarity. It remained with them not because it was dramatic, but because it was unmistakably human. In the cold winter of 1944, surrounded by violence and uncertainty, a simple act of respect had offered a glimpse of the world that would eventually emerge from the war's shadow. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson. Even the smallest choices, made by ordinary soldiers in unremarkable places, can shape how enemies become neighbors, how bitterness fades, and how the long work of peace begins with gestures that remind us who we are, even in the darkest of times.